In this program, you will learn about the Louisiana Purchase and why it may have been the single most important real estate transaction in history. You will meet Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, partners in a fascinating journey of daring discovery. And you will encounter the teenage mother Sacagawea, who trusted her instincts, leading and protecting Lewis and Clark through the unmapped wilderness. By the time Thomas Jefferson was sworn in as the third President of the United States in 1801, he had already played a crucial role in the early development of the United States, most notably as the author of the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson envisioned a country whose strength would be based on its common people, especially its farmers. He saw in the hard work of tilling the soil and farming the landscape a national purpose. Jefferson's fondest hope was that America would become a nation characterized by self-sufficient farmers. This was known as Jefferson's agrarian dream. When Jefferson was elected president, there were 16 states, the original 13 colonies, plus Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. However, our country actually extended beyond these states to include the land of present-day states Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. The territory beyond the Mississippi was simply referred to as the West. Jefferson received his greatest political support from the people of the West and the South, most of whom were farmers. His agrarian dream, however, was a nightmare for enslaved Africans, who performed much of the manual labor in the South. Furthermore, as farmers kept moving farther and farther west, past the Appalachian Mountains to cultivate land, native people already living there were expected to conform to the settlers' ways or move on. This led to increasing conflict between whites and Indians on the expanding American frontier. Although most of the Westerners supported Jefferson, many did not care much about his policies. What most of the settlers who moved west really wanted was to sell cash crops to new markets. As America moved further west, the country became more and more reliant on the use of the Mississippi River and the port of New Orleans for trade. New Orleans was the heart of the large Louisiana territory. It did not belong to the United States. In 1763, after the 7 Years' War, control of the Louisiana Territory passed from France to Spain. This was beneficial to the Americans. When Spain held this Louisiana Territory, the United States had a neighbor that was too weak to be very threatening. That changed when France regained control, and American farmers lost access to the port where they could sell to merchants from other countries. France was ruled by Napoleon, a military genius who had ambitions to create a worldwide empire. In 1803, Jefferson sent James Monroe to France on a mission. He was to join Ambassador Robert Livingston there and convince France to sell New Orleans and territory east of it to the United States. Jefferson was prepared to pay up to $10 million.
But what the Americans didn't know was that the French had a lot of money problems, financing all their wars. Their troops were spread out too thin, and Napoleon had some very legitimate concerns that he couldn't bring his army in to occupy Louisiana anyway, because the British were ready to block him.
Monroe and Livingston were unaware of the extent of Napoleon's problems. They were very surprised when France offered to sell them not only New Orleans, but the entire Louisiana Territory for $15 million. The landmass was far more than Jefferson ever thought possible to obtain. This was an opportunity to more than double the size of the lands held by the United States.
After Thomas Jefferson had signed and agreed to the Louisiana Purchase, he was worried that it wouldn't get through Congress. And the reason for that is that the Constitution of the United States did not specifically give the president the right to acquire land.
The constitutionality of the Louisiana Purchase greatly concerned Jefferson. He strongly believed in maintaining limits on the power of the central government. That included the president. He also knew that the United States could not afford to pass up France's offer. Congress voted to approve the Louisiana Purchase as a treaty with France.
The Louisiana Purchase, not only did it more than double the size of the American land area, it also set the stage for all the subsequent events that happened in the 1800s. People began in larger numbers moving out west. They began to settle in lands that were not even necessarily, part of the Louisiana Purchase, but just continuing to migrate westward, opening new trade routes for the Americans, opening new colonization possibilities for the Americans.
Now that the Louisiana Territory was part of the United States, how could the territory best be used? Jefferson had some ideas, but needed first to have the lands surveyed and studied. One use Jefferson saw for Louisiana was to relocate Indians there. He still hoped the Indians could be encouraged to abandon their homelands and their way of life to become farmers like the settlers. More importantly, Jefferson hoped that the vast Louisiana Territory would reveal a Northwest Passage.
They wanted to find, or they hoped they would find, a way that they could get from the Atlantic Ocean out to the Pacific Ocean by one series of connected waterways. And what that would do would mean that you would become, whoever controlled this Northwest Passage and discovered it first, would then control basically trade in all of the important world trade centers, Europe, the Americas, and Asia.
Jefferson chose a young soldier, Captain Meriwether Lewis, to lead an exploratory expedition into the new lands to the west. Lewis grew up on family plantations in Virginia and Georgia, where he learned all about hunting, trapping, and surviving in the woods. Captain Lewis was a skilled surveyor and knew how to map the latitude and longitude of points along the rivers he would navigate on the expedition. He studied medicine and learned how to collect plant, animal, and mineral specimens. For his co-commander, Lewis chose William Clark. Clark was especially skilled at drawing maps, guiding boats through treacherous currents, and frontier doctoring.
William Clark was, I guess we would call him a frontiersman from Kentucky, and he met Meriwether Lewis during their military service, and he had proven to be quite a good leader, and so he was chosen to assist in the expedition. And even though he wasn't officially in the rank of captain, he served in that capacity throughout the whole expedition with Meriwether Lewis.
Now that the expedition leaders were in place, supplies had to be gathered, and an expedition party formed. They would travel by keelboat, so they would have room only for the most necessary items: pots and pans, cloths, and trade items. Lewis met Clark at the Falls of the Ohio River on October 15, 1803. They began to assemble a crew. When selecting volunteers for the expedition, Lewis and Clark recruited men who could perform specific tasks that would be needed along the way. They recruited hunters, gunsmiths, and carpenters. They found boat builders and men who could navigate boats upriver. Lewis and Clark traveled down the Ohio River. Along the way, they hired an interpreter, George Grouillard, who was part French-Canadian and part Shawnee Indian. Also assisting them was Clark's African-American slave, York. York performed many roles during the expedition. He was given many of the same tasks and privileges of the white men, and aided in the hunting. He helped guard the traveling party and assisted setting up camp. He was also present during many of the party's encounters with the Indians, the first black man most of the Indians had ever seen. Where the Ohio met the Mississippi River, the party turned north and traveled up the Mississippi to St. Louis at the mouth of the Missouri River. St. Louis was then a small town, but it was the center of fur trading for the whole region. There, they set up winter camp and finalized their selection of 22 men led by 3 sergeants. They also hired 2 French guides. When they set out up the Missouri on May 14, 1804, They were escorted by soldiers for part of the way. In all, the traveling party upon departure numbered 45 men. As they struggled to navigate their boat up the river against the current, Lewis often went on land by foot to study the countryside and the wildlife inhabiting it. The vast wilderness impressed him deeply, and he often paused to sketch the wildlife he encountered: the bison, the fox, the mountain lion. The first American Indians they met along their journey were the Otos and Missouri of the Great Plains region. They held a council in which Lewis addressed the Indians.
One of the directives from Thomas Jefferson to the captains was to inform all of the native people out there in this territory that the title of the land had been transferred from Spain to France and now to the United States. And then he intended to carry out his vision for this big piece of land.
In the European tradition, there's land, and people have title to the land, therefore they own it. In Indian cultures, almost all of them, there's no sense of it. Somebody owns property. Everybody lives on the land. Everybody uses the land.
In the cases where you only had sign language trying to convey this message, I could see where it would be very difficult to convey that message that the president wanted to get out there to the Native American people.
As the party moved further up the Missouri River in what today is South Dakota, Lewis and Clark were barred from continuing by the Teton Sioux Indians. Both sides raised their weapons and made threats, but the two sides made peace before armed conflict took place. The Sioux relented to let Lewis and Clark pass through after securing the gift of tobacco.
And I think at the time Lewis and Clark were coming through, I don't think most of the Native American people had any idea about what was really to follow. That the vision of the president was to open up this land for settlers and for agriculture. And in the process of doing that, the Indian tribes would all be displaced.